Recording in progress.
Good afternoon. My presentation is on the Chechnya conflict, freedom fighters or terrorists. So I thought that we should start off with some background information so you kind of understand where all of this is coming from. So Chechnya was fighting in order to become their own Islamic state, separated from Russia, leading to their downfall in 1858. Following the dates, many died for years to come until a successful revolt. Um, sorry, a successful revolt took down the Soviets, claiming Chechnya independence. Though it didn't last and ended up resulting in Russia invading Chechnya, killing more civilians. These tragic events are just the beginning of Russia, and Chechnya's war history. So, Russia claimed and portrayed these freedom fighters as terrorists, but considering how the situation started, it kind of like seemed that Russia really just wants to demean their fight by that term, and that term I meant by terrorists, making it seem as if they're only out to kill civilians with no purpose at all. The decision making of Western policy didn't do a good job at all with their decision making because they either felt sympathy due to strategic attacks by Chechen's military leader, and on the other hand, they also felt that Russia was handling the situation poorly by using their excessive force as a means to an end. In order to see if using this as like a terroristic strategy to become free is or isn't uh how do I put this? In order to see if this is justifiable by using a terroristic strategy, the reading goes into in depth with the following topics: definition of terrorism, are the resistance leaders terrorists, questioning of legitimate targets, and the question of a terrorist strategy. So, explaining the I apologize for that. I just had to get my mind straight. But so basically, based on John Locke's theory, the founding fathers of the United States believe that any group has a right to rebel against a tyrannical government. Yet, states usually do not handle the situation with criminal procedure in order to bring down the resistance. As explained in the reading, some states follow the British colonial principle that in order to maintain law and order, it's necessary for the government itself to break it for a time, which is pretty much what Russia has been doing, or what Russia did, especially with the journalist's strong criticism towards Russian policy. She was removed from the world, and there's essentially nothing you could do to prevent it. They didn't go through any trial or anything. They just killed her off because they didn't like what she was doing. Now we're going to talk about the resistance leaders. All three of the resistance leaders took refuge in other countries in order to escape from being extradited in Russia. But honestly, what surprised me the most is that all three of these countries had denied Russia's request. This is because they believed that Russia's initial claims for why they should be extradited in Russia were baseless with no evidence, and that they knew that they wouldn't receive proper criminal procedure. Instead, they thought that if they went back to Russia, they would just be killed on the spot. Clearly not sitting well with Russia, they decided to move on their own to assassinate one of the leaders hidden in Qatar. All this ended up resulting in Russia applying its own concept of national interest in the designation of terrorist groups. So Putin invited invites the Hamas, who were on the U.S. FTO list, to Moscow, showing that they never even considered them terrorists. So, legitimate targets, evidence. From all the attacks led by the Chechen groups, it would lead to a total of 1,544 people killed and 3,463 injured from July 1993 to September 2004. Explained in the reading, by accepting the conservative estimates of deaths in the wars from 1994 to the present, discussed above then, the numbers of deaths from terrorism by Chechen groups is likely to be less than 3% of the total number, which means that technically this can't be labeled as terrorism by Russia. It can also be said that certain incidents resulted in high death toll because of Russia's poor tactical response and their brute force, not taking into account civilian lives at risk. Now, question of a terrorist strategy. The key determining factor in any movement or rebellion against a government force are the civilians for both sides. Chechnya's military leader on multiple occasions made it clear that the use of terroristic strategy was only a last resort tactic. Honestly, I think that if he had reached out with a terroristic sort of way from the start, then it would have been really viewed as a terroristic movement, especially in the eyes of civilians. Can terroristic strategy be used without doing any harm? On the slide is a situation for a way to use such tactic without harming innocent civilians. But well, with the airplane right here. But without harm, sometimes it doesn't always end up being like a happy ending like this. Being able to negotiate with Russia to release their prisoners, yeah, like that was a perfect scenario, but it doesn't always go that way. And this leads me to the Beslan school siege. So this is a perfect example of how it doesn't always become a happy ending. The Beslan school siege held by the Chechen forces in order to gain their independence for like a negotiation led to a massacre of the hostages. The Chechen leader explained this was a terrorist act, but it wasn't out of context. This attack wasn't out of spite or hatred, but for a cause, a way to get a message out quickly, hoping that something like this would stop the genocide of the Chechen people. So the conclusion, clearly the people of Chechnya had the right to fear physical genocide from Russia. The fact that this is terroristic strategy was a purpose to be a last resort is believed that in theory, the threat of genocide would justify the use of terrorism. From the summed up conclusion in the reading, by any balanced reckoning, Russia's reckless and disproportionate use of force against civilians in Chechnya at time has been genocidal. In particular, its reliance on indiscriminate bombardment of civilian areas in the well-documented cases of massacres. Even though some of the terroristic attacks led by the Chechen forces are horrific, they were left with their own last resort in order to do something. The question is, do you really believe that this was a terroristic act, or is it justifiable in order to prevent genocide? And here are the following questions. Do you think that terroristic strategy is justifiable for a purpose like this? Was this the only way to get a message across? And do you think that there was another tactic or a way to go without resulting in so many casualties? Thank you. That's it.